we're going to talk about the designs of the guitars now. We're talking in the very basic, most common kinds of designs that we're talking about. The oldest vintage, most popular designs of guitars are the ones we're talking about: Strats, Les Pauls, Telecasters. These are, guitars that were designed in the early 50s, and still everything else is based on those designs. Whether they look like it or not, they're still based on the designs that are those old classic designs.
Okay.
Which will segue nicely into the guitar talk itself. And again, we're still just focused on solid body electric guitars for this genre. We're not talking about guitars that are jazz boxes and semi hollows and things like that. For by and large, you're not going to get that kind of guitar in this style of music, because in a lot of respects they don't make well with loud amplifiers being cranked the way we've been talking about them having, running them full out. If you're running semi-hollow guitars through those kinds of rigs, there's an awful lot of feedback, associated with that is unwanted.
Yeah.
So,
and I would also argue that a semi-hollow guitar is not really a beginner's guitar either, right? I mean, it's generally...
Not anymore. I mean, there was a time where that was true, obviously, when, prior to the advent of solid body electrics. But yeah, I think, no one's first guitar is a 335 these days,
They're expensive too.
They're very expensive because they're harder to make.
Very pretty though. And I love the sound for what they do. But yeah.
Yeah, they're great in certain contexts, and they can even be good in the context of this genre, but it's rare.
Right. I know like a band, like a semi-recent band that used those guitars is Oasis. I know. Like
I think also...
Yeah. And of course the blues guys.
Dave Grohl uses some kind of a hybrid Gibson thing that is sort of like an ES-35 body with like a Firebird neck on it. I don't know what it's called. Wow. It's his own custom model, and it's semi-hollow. Okay. And, they're playing loud rock and roll. So, I mean, it can be done. It's not that it can't be done. But, I mean, Alex Lifeson was doing it in Rush in the 70s. He was known for having a 335 or a 355. And he made it work. But, there are easier ways to get it done, as you said, and cheaper ways to get it done. Those guitars tend to be more expensive. They tend to... Instead of responding well to feedback, they tend to squeal and squawk, and that's one of the reasons they're not very popular in loud music.
Right. Yeah. If you're standing in front of enormous Marshall stack with one of those things, you'll get only feedback.
Yeah, but I mean, there's good feedback, and then there's the horrible feedback, right?
Yeah.
There's the desirable warm feedback that you get where the amp. You interact with the amp, and you get this thing where you can start getting the singing feedback that you can play with the bar and make it do all kinds of things. And then there's the things that just squeak and squawk, right?
Yeah.
And the squeak and squawk is what you get from hollow bodies and semi-hollow bodies when they get loud.
Where you don't get control, and you can
because you don't have that it's that tone chamber that's inside of the guitar that's reacting, and it doesn't have that mass in there to keep it from producing it creates those bad unwanted feedback sounds.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we got the solid body guitars.
Right. Now, very few solid body electric guitar designs create truly distinctive sounds.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and when you think about it,
because there's so much fuzz in marketing being made about woods being used and the wood of the neck and the wood of the body.
Yeah, and it's not that it isn't a factor; it is a factor, but the word marketing does come to mind here, and some of this is marketing stuff, and some of this is tone snobbery and all of this kind of stuff, the desire for vintage, and there's a lot of trends in the design. But what I want to talk about is really that these early designs that are the most popular guitars of all time, the Strat, the Telecaster, the Les Paul, the SG, if you will, everything that has come since then is basically, you know, chasing one of those sounds. It's either chasing a Fender sound or it's chasing a Gibson sound. And, you know, all of these guitars that are made for, for metal and, for shred and all of these things, at their core, they're still solid body electrics that have a humbucker in them or a single coil in them. And they are going after one of these tones or the other. So when you think about it, the design itself, very few electric guitar designs create truly distinctive sounds. And the first two that come to mind that do are the Les Paul and the Telecaster.
Okay.
Now, Stratocasters have an iconic sound, or sounds, if you will. They're by far the most popular guitar of all time. But the Stratocaster is not so much known for its distinctive sound, but for its tonal versatility. And there's a difference there.
But the Telecaster kind of has like a very distinctive twangy sound, you know?
Exactly. So I contend it's easier to fake a Strat sound with a non-Strat guitar than it is to fake a Les Paul or a Telecaster sound. And when you start talking about super Strats, which are Strats with humbuckers in them, that's definitely true. All you have to do to get, a super Strat to sound more like a classic Strat is to use a coil cutter and silence one of the humbuckers coils so you can get a single coil sound out of that, and there you are. You pretty much have a Fender-y sound out of your super Strat.
And super Strats, those were big in the 80s, right? From like the metal.
They were very big, and they're and to a degree they're still big. But if you go back, the first of these guitars was the Telecaster. It predated the Strat and it predated the Les Paul. And the reason its tone is so distinctive is really due to its bridge pan. That part around the bridge that was usually brass back in the day. I think they've changed what it is. It's not always brass anymore. Sometimes it's steel. But the bridge pan is what gives the Tele its characteristic twang.
Okay.
And you can make a Telecaster sound like a Strat, but it's hard to make any other guitar sound like a Telecaster unless you put one of those bridge pans on it.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I knew that Telecasters were known for that. I've played around with them, and that's the only guitar that sounds like a Telecaster. But,
right, and you got to start asking yourself, why is that?
Yeah, why is that? Yeah.
Why is that? What's different about a Telecaster than a Strat, than a Gibson? And you start looking at the thing, and if you know how much the bridge really is a huge tonal factor on any guitar, that bridge pan, that big piece of metal sitting there, is the reason it has that twang. Now, you can make a Telecaster sound like a Strat, but like I said, it's hard to make any other guitar sound like a Tele.
But that lipstick element in the neck is also pretty unique. Although
and most people replace that, quite honestly, unless it's like a vintage guitar that they don't want to mess with. It's not a very usable pickup in that.
It's
slot.
A weird sound, yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of people will put in a different pickup there, something that's a more modern alternative.
But and this is that. What kind of? It's not really. It's sort of a single coil, right? It is.
Well, they're both single coils. Okay, they're both single coils, but it's a different kind of single coil. And I've never been a Tele guy, so I'm not like super into all of the aspects of the Tele. But
Let's see. What's a good example of a Telecaster sound?
Well, there's a lot of guys playing Tellies, but I guess if you want to look at a Telecaster in this genre, you might want to look at something like Jeff Beck and the Yardbirds.
Like, what's a song I can pull up as an example?
Bring up Heart Full of Soul.
It's a Heart Full of Soul by the Yardbirds.
Mm-hmm. He's also using a fuzz pedal.
Man, I need to listen to all this music that I'm putting on more, man. Especially with headphones. It's so good.
Yeah. So, again, we also talked about the fact that Zeppelin 1, that was a Telecaster, but it doesn't really sound like a characteristic Telecaster. And oddly enough, it's easier to make a Telecaster sound like a Les Paul than it is for a lot of other guitars.
Right.
That said, you know, if you put a humbucker in a Telecaster, it actually sounds more like a Les Paul than a humbucker and a Strat does, in my opinion. And my guess on that is because the Tele has a thicker body and the bridge pan adds something similar to the top end that you get out of the Les Paul's maple cap. We haven't talked about the Paul. That's the next thing I'm going to talk about. But
yeah, that's going to be the big one.
A Les Paul's body is mahogany, and it usually has, except for in the mid-50s, it usually has a maple cap on top. So you get this rich, warm sound from the mahogany, and you get some top-end and brightness from the maple cap. And if you're talking about a Telecaster, you're getting that brightness from that bridge pan we're talking about. So if you put a humbucker in a Telecaster, and you treat it right with your EQ, it can sound a lot like a Les Paul. And if you want to hear that, put on Jeff Beck's "'Cause We Ended as Lovers." Put on the solo of that, and you're hearing basically a Telecaster with a humbucker in the bridge position.
Yeah, that does sound kind of like a Les Paul. My God, that guy can play, eh? Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
The cover of that album, by the way, has him holding a Les Paul. That's kind of
right.
funny.
He was playing both at that time. He was in the middle of the recording of that album, and he had this old Telecaster that was like one he used in the Yardbirds that had like he had sanded down the body a little bit to make it more contoured like a Strat on the upper back part of the body.
Wait, so he actually took a belt sander to a guitar to just kind of modify it? I mean,
yeah, and it was a vintage 50s Telecaster, and I think it was the kind that only had the one pickup. I can't remember exactly, but
oh man,
Seymour Duncan was working on it for him, and Seymour Duncan loved the guitar, and he traded that guitar to Seymour Duncan for the one that he played on that track you just heard. It was called a Telegib. Was what they called it, and I believe it had two humbuckers, and I may have had a middle position single coil. I can't recall exactly, but it was a Telecaster with two humbuckers in it, and he used it on that track. And to me, you know, it kind of is a hybrid sound on that. When you hear it in the solo, it still has some of that Telecaster characteristic to it, but you know, it had also some of that humbucker thing going on. For example, I thought Jimmy Page's Telecaster sounded a lot more like a Les Paul on Zeppelin 1.
Right.
All right, so we've talked a lot about Les Pauls. I should, for the people who don't know what they are, they're a very distinctive, iconic guitar. It's the kind of guitar you see with Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin. You see it with Slash. You see it with Zakk Wylde. You see it with Joe Perry a lot of the time. It's a it's an iconic guitar that sounds like nothing else. The reason is it's got a thick mahogany body, and like I said, it usually has a maple cap on top of that mahogany, which adds some bite to the guitar and some sustain. More importantly, they use Gibson, in fact, uses a shorter scale length. And when you combine those two factors together, they make a Les Paul sound different from pretty much any other of the Gibsons that they used when they were just having a slab of mahogany body, like without the cap.
What is the scale length?
It's advertised as 24.75, and there are some articles on that on my website. We talk about how that really plays out reality.
I mean, what is scale length in general?
Scale length is basically we're taking the distance between where the string starts at the bridge, where it sits on the saddle, where it starts to be able to be, where you have to anchor a string at both ends, okay, but where it's anchored and where it actually is in the playable range, that's from the bridge to the nut.
Okay.
And the length is determined by math to determine where the frets are supposed to be positioned on the neck. And a Fender scale is considered 25.5 inches, and a Gibson scale is considered 24.75 inches.
Okay.
And that means the scale on all Gibson guitars is shorter, which means in some respects it's easier to bend the strings.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too. Is that a Fender Stratocaster is harder to play than a Gibson Les Paul.
If they're both set up well, there is some truth to that, but it depends. I mean, a lot of things depend on, like, if you're someone with small hands, it may be that a Gibson scale is better for you. Guys like Jakey Lee, he said he has very small hands. Even when he had his Strats built, he had them built with a Gibson scale.
Interesting.
So he had, he couldn't stretch as far. And if you were a guy with very big hands, it might not be that a Gibson is the best choice for you. But for a lot of people have both kinds of guitars. So it's not that big a deal going back and forth, but it's noteworthy that when you combine the factors of the design structure, that scale length does make a difference in sound. A longer scale length should produce a little bit more low end because the string's longer, and you can, it should be a little bit, you get more bass out of it. It's not always true. There are other factors involved, but in general, your string bending should be a little easier on shorter scale.
I guess that's why bass guitars have super long necks, and they have like they're much bigger too, right?
Well, they typically are, but there are short scale basses.
Okay.
And Gibson made some of them.
And didn't Van Halen have also like the super short scale guitars?
Those were kind of those were like one-off things. Those were not production model things that were ever he had some bizarre one-off kinds of guitars.
Okay.
They used on little guitars. I don't know where one would get one of those or anything like it, but generally speaking, Gibson had one scale length, Fender had a different scale length. And even within Gibson, the difference between a Les Paul and an SG and a Flying V and an Explorer, these are their solid body electric designs.
Okay.
The Les Paul has, in its sonic frequency, a lower mid-range frequency peak than the other Gibsons, so it sounds a little different. It's a subtle thing. It's not easy to quantify. You have to have very good ears and been listening a long time to hear the difference between what a V sounds like compared to a Les Paul on a recording.
There's definitely a difference, right?
There is definitely a difference if you know what to listen for. But I mean, it's not something the layman's going to pick up on. This is something that guitarists who are experienced will pick up on over time.
What's a typical player that used a Flying V as their main guitar?
Michael Schenker.
Okay.
You want to play some of that?
Yeah, sure. What's a good track that I should pull up?
Let's do UFO's I'm a Loser. Go right to the solo.
It's good.
It's fantastic.
And a typical SG sound would be AC/DC, right?
Yeah, anything from Angus, certainly. I would say is much more characteristic than like the Iommi SG sound, because Iommi was playing SGs that were not always Gibson SGs. So, yeah. And if you want a characteristic Les Paul sound, a terrific characteristic Les Paul sound, put on Blue Murder's Blue Murder, the title track from the title album, and go to the solo of that. And you'll...
Okay. Man, I wish I could play these songs in their entirety, but
it's all right. This is good because it gives people listening a sonic reference.
Let's see. Go back a little bit. See, am I there?
Yeah.
Badass drums too.
Yeah.
That's good.
So,
My God, who is that?
that's John Sykes, man.
That guy's a badass.
Yes, he is. That's John Sykes. He's a motherfucker.
Yeah.
He's absolutely insanely good. So, but Les Paul sounds, classic Les Paul sounds. Obviously, a lot of Led Zeppelin. Obviously, Slash. Obviously, Zakk Wylde. You know, all of these things. Randy Rhoads. Much of the first album was Les Paul. And you can hear, compared to the Schenker, you can hear it has that lower girth. You know, it's got a thickness to it that the Flying V didn't have, right? It's got some ball weight in it that is extra,
Right.
And nothing else sounds like that. And despite what people will tell you, it's hard to get that sound with anything other than that design.
Right.
So then we'll move on to
whenever I go to the guitar store, I always just pick up a Les Paul, and one thing I always notice is that it's like twice as heavy as any other guitar hanging around there.
They're ergonomically horrible. Okay, they're not balanced. All of the weight hangs to one side. As you get older, into my age, strapping one of those things on and keeping it on for a 2-hour rehearsal, your back and shoulders are feeling it at the end of it. It's not ergonomically good, but there's nothing that sounds like it. And that's why a lot of people were trying to do the Super Strat thing, and trying to get some of those kinds of tones without having those Les Paul ergonomic issues.
And they sound cool, but it doesn't sound quite the same.
No.